You are listening to the Roberta Glass True Crime Report, putting the true back in true crime. From New York City, Roberta Glass is now on the record.
On October 24th, 2011, in Potsdam, New York, 12-year-old Garrett Phillips was found in the home he shared with his mother and half-brother, hanging on to life, suffering from what would become fatal injuries. His mother's Jamaican ex-boyfriend, Oral Nick Hillary, was tried and acquitted of Garrett's murder in 2016. However, in 2019, HBO released a documentary entitled Who Killed Garrett Phillips? The documentary depicted Nick Hillary as a victim of a racially motivated witch hunt, but like so many true crime documentaries, left much of the prosecution's case and the evidence against Mr. Hillary on the cutting room floor. Joining me to discuss the murder of Garrett Phillips and Mr. Hillary's legal odyssey is Thomas J. Mortati. A graduate of Fordham and Albany Law School, Tom has been a practicing civil attorney for over 3 decades. Mr. Mortati made news in 2019 when he obtained a record $7.4 million verdict in the St. Lawrence County Supreme Court in a medical malpractice case. He has been featured in the aforementioned HBO documentary Who Killed Garrett Phillips, as well as the 2020 episode Rear Window about Garrett Phillips. And that's the subject of today's episode. Welcome, Tom Mortati.
Thank you. Happy to be back.
So yeah, we've been through it with this case. So just for those who don't know, what were the circumstances? How was Garrett Phillips murdered and how was he found?
Sure. So, Garrett was, as it turned out, he suffered from asphyxiation, which is ultimately what led to his death. And when he was, initially found, again, one of the intricacies of this case is that Garrett's not laying on the ground with, a gunshot wound or a knife sticking out his chest. He's found partly inside one of the back bedrooms in this apartment on the second floor of this building on Market Street in Potsdam, old Victorian kind of style of sorts. And he's unresponsive. He's not dead. He's unresponsive. He's hardly breathing, if at all. And so the initial reaction when the police, and again, I know you and I have been down this road. It wasn't a circumstance where the police come bashing the door down. They basically get a phone call, not even to 911, but to the main dispatch line from the next door neighbor, Marissa Vogel, who says, "Gee, I think I heard something, a crash, a no or an O or an help." And she's almost apologetic when she calls, if you listen to the recording. So the police eventually get the landlord to come and open the door to the apartment because they don't have a basis to just bash the door down. And Garrett's unfortunately unresponsive on the floor. So the first officer in there races back to the car to get his CPR bag, calls dispatch to get an ambulance, and Garrett is brought to Canton Potsdam Hospital, which is literally around the corner from the apartment building. But unfortunately, the efforts to revive him are unsuccessful, and he's eventually declared dead about 3 hours. So this is roughly 5:25 when the police get into the room, or apartment, I should say, and approximately 2-3 hours later is when he was ultimately declared, when their efforts at reviving him over at the hospital in the emergency department were unsuccessful.
Why was Nick Hillary a suspect?
So, Nick was a suspect along with a lot of other people. So, one of the things police look to, of course, immediately in any type of homicide, they're going to look at the immediate family, immediate friends, immediate relationships, right? So Nick was the recent ex-boyfriend of Garrett's mother, Tandy Cyrus, and Tandy had broken up with Nick that summer. So again, this is October 24, 2011 is the date of the homicide. was roughly in the middle of the summer when she tells Nick, this isn't working out. We're my boys and I are going to move out. She gets a new apartment shortly after Labor Day. Nick actually helps them move into that apartment, and they stay somewhat on a friendly basis of sorts over the next roughly month and a half. So, the police, they were looked at a lot of different people who had been in Tandy's life leading up to that point. And, they get information from, family and friends that Nick and Garrett did not get along, and that Garrett was really one of the primary driving forces behind Mom breaking up with Nick. And so initially, again, he's just a person of interest, really, Roberta. Nick becomes and helps become a suspect himself by some of the things he did, how he acted, some of the information he gives the police in the beginning, and actually information he didn't give the police, that they learned from others, and realizing that when they first went to speak to Nick in what was really a death notification, he'd already been contacted about what happened. We can get into that a little bit more, but basically the police are looking at a lot of different people in Tandy's life, not the least of which her most recent ex-boyfriend of just a couple months ago, who was known to not have a good relationship with Garrett. At least everybody else on the planet says Garrett and Nick didn't get along, other than Nick, who says, oh, we got along great.
And he also wasn't taking the breakup very well. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so, Tandy goes to Nick, roughly middle of July, let's say, 2011. It's my boys, Garrett and Erin, it's not working out. I need to get in my own place. And Nick, again, he denies this stuff, but other family members, Tandy's mom, stepdad, who worked, by the way, they also worked at Clarkson University, her stepdad in basically physical plant type things, and her mom in the custodial. And he's going and lobbying these people, if you will, to try to convince Tandy to get back to them, that she's making a big mistake, that she's letting a 12-year-old run her life. And he speaks with her sister, Toni, I believe, her mom, stepdad. And all of these people have similar stories where, for example, Nick goes and finds her mom on campus in a part of campus he should never be at. He's a soccer coach. He has no business going over to one of the dorms or whatever, especially during the summertime when there aren't students there and whatever. And again, he was not pleased about this breakup. And in fact, for at least a period of time immediately after he moved them in the apartment, he had a key to and granted, she gave it to him, but then as time goes by, she ultimately decides this isn't a good idea, where, Nick actually shows up, on, I believe, 2 different occasions, unannounced, one roughly in the middle of the night. She wakes up to find him standing in her bedroom. And of course, is a little perturbed about that. She decides to keep the peace and let him stay. But after that incident, not terribly long before this horrible tragedy occurs, that she says, "Now give me the key back. We're not going to do this anymore, not even on a friendly level, if you will."
And why did the police find Nick Hillary's behavior at the police station odd and suspicious?
So a couple things there. So I mentioned before that the police actually initially talked to Nick the night of the murder. So and this is going to be a death notification. Nick is not a suspect. He's not a person of interest. He's just somebody who was close to this kid's family that they want to notify, because eventually they want to talk to everybody they can to find, you want to plot this kid's life. You want to plot his day on the day in question. Who knows, who sees him where, etc. So they initially call Nick. It's on a recorded line. And then Lieutenant Mark Murray, he's now the chief of police, but at the time he's the detective lieutenant. He calls and says, Mr. Hillary, we were hoping you could come down to the station. Again, this is the night of the murder, around 9:30, let's say. And he calls Nick. And one thing is he misidentifies the child as being a 10-year-old. Second thing, he never even mentions the name. And third, he basically says something happened with one of Tandy's boys, and can you come down and talk to us? We're trying to get information. And Nick says, oh, sure, yeah, I'll be right down. Never bothers to stop and say, wait a second, what do you mean what happened? And and Murray actually identifies the age wrong as 10-year-old instead of 12-year-old. Tandy had a 12-year-old Garrett, and at the time, 8-year-old Erin. Nick doesn't even correct him. He just, oh yeah, Brian, I'll be right down. Not even know what happened. I mean, the first words out of anybody's mouth would be, oh my gosh, what happened? The police, Murray and former state police Bureau of Criminal Investigation investigator Gary Snell go to Nick's apartment. And it's Snell who really starts realizing something doesn't seem right about this guy. He's not perturbed. He's, when they tell him, mind you, at the time, they believe this is the first knowledge that Nick has that Garrett's dead, and he acts upset or whatever. Well, they come to find out not long thereafter that, in fact, he'd been notified before they even got there that Garrett was dead and something had happened to him. So he puts on a show, if you will, for them at the apartment, at least as they come to think later. And then, as you mentioned, or excuse me, as you were asking, Roberta, so the police actually asked him to come down for questioning 2 days after the murder on the morning of October 26th. And they're in Mark Murray's office. This is all video recorded. And they initially are asking him some generic questions about some of the other kids that Garrett would hang around with and whatever. And then the conversation starts to turn to, where were you on the night of the murder type questions? And Nick immediately stops cooperating. I'm not here to talk about that. I don't want to talk about any of that stuff. He wants to leave. They prevent him from leaving because they tell him basically, hey, we're getting a search warrant because they've developed some other information in the 48 hours preceding. They're going to get a search warrant for his person, his car, his apartment, and his phone. And a couple things, Roberta, that are curious is, I think, an understatement. Some of this is on a recorded video. They allow Nick to smoke in Murray's office, okay, with the hopes that he's going to use or deposit one of the cigarette butts, let's say, in an ashtray. Obviously, that's a way to go get somebody's DNA, right? So Nick smokes a cigarette. And I'll be honest with you, the first time I watched the video, I didn't notice this part until they said, take a close look at what he does with the cigarette butt. He stuffs out or, rubs out the cigarette butt, and then he puts it in his pocket and basically field strips, crushes this thing up in his pocket so that nobody can get the cigarette butt. And then later on, Roberta, he's moved into, there's a little kitchen break room area where he's given a pizza, I think some water. He's allowed to smoke another cigarette, and he's watched in there by a state trooper, basically. And he does two odd things. One is that he smokes another cigarette, nothing odd about that. The odd thing is that he tries to stuff it down the sink drain, okay? Not put it in an ashtray or a cup or whatever. And the police ultimately actually took apart the J-trap under the sink. And that's where they got the cigarette butt, where they got his initial DNA. And interesting, one of the other funny things, if you will, is, he eventually eats some of the pizza, and it's at this point in the day that he was able to get in touch with his local civil attorney. He had an attorney involved in some family court things. Jane Garland, I believe, was her name. And Jane comes, and according to the trooper who's watching, Jane comes in there, speaks with him. Again, the trooper is not privy to what they talk about. That's attorney-client privileged. But the trooper sees Garland take a bite out of that remaining piece of pizza and then take that remainder of the pizza and put it in her purse or bag or whatever. Again, this was according to a trooper who was tasked with observing Mr. Hillary. So, odd behavior, absolutely. It obviously speaks to something else. Who does that kind of thing? If you're not trying to prevent the police from getting DNA information, if you will.
And it's the only case that I've talked about where someone has put a piece of pizza in their purse or thrown a cigarette butt down a drain. And also, the other thing I found interesting is that you mentioned in another episode that Nick Hillary, the first call he made after Garrett's murder was to Mannyy Trifari, who was Nick Hillary had been a soccer player, former soccer team member who had become a lawyer, Manny Trifari, who now represented him, went on to represent him in this civil case. So we're talking about, there's two different things related to Garrett Phillips' murder. There's the civil case that Nick Hillary made against the town of Potsdam, and then there's the criminal trial. Can you explain your involvement in this case?
Sure. So I get involved in representing, actually, it's the village of Potsdam. There's a town of Potsdam too, but
I made that mistake last time.
That's quite all right. So what happens, Nick Hillary, and you mentioned this, that, and the police don't know this at the time. It's not until later, pulling phone records or whatever, but he's frantically trying to get in touch with his best friend from when they played together at St. Lawrence University men's soccer team, Mannyy, I think it's Manny Tafari, is an attorney down in the city, New York City. And ultimately, Tafari comes up to the Potsdam area within, I don't know, about 24, 36 hours of Nick being questioned by the police. And they're going and doing a press conference with the Watertown Daily Times. And basically they end up, now, mind you, no charges are filed against this guy at this point. He's not even declared by the police as a suspect or person of interest. In fact, the Potsdam Police Department went to great lengths to keep saying, we don't have any suspects or persons of interest. They don't mention anybody. But this is a small town. People knew that Nick was being questioned. Word got out, etc. So Tafari files in New York. If you want to sue a municipality, the village of Potsdam in this circumstance, you have to file something called a notice of claim before you can file a lawsuit, which allows the municipality to then take testimony from that person pre-civil lawsuit. So I get involved because I did work for the insurance company that insured the village of Potsdam. It actually had another very minor case with Potsdam PD before that, roughly in the 12 months maybe before that. So Mark Murray, the lieutenant, I knew him by speaking with him on the phone a few times. And I just so happen to be the person that gets this assignment from the insurance company. Hey, you got to go, defend the village in this civil case, or it's not even a case yet. Again, this is something he had to file as a condition precedent to a formal lawsuit. And so I reach out to Mark Murray. In fact, I read the notice of claim, and I'm in the Albany area, which is basically 3.5 hours over the river and through the woods to get to Potsdam. Hadn't even heard about this thing. And it's a couple of months after the murder. And I read the notice of claim. I jump on the computer. I'm like, oh my God, this involves the murder of a 12-year-old, an unsolved murder of a 12-year-old. And that's how I end up getting involved in representing the village. So I probably should stop there because you probably have some other questions of which way you want me to go with that.
So it's just interesting. So the civil suit started before the criminals? I don't know any other case like this that I've covered where before he was even charged with Garrett's murder, Nick Hillary was suing the village of Potsdam for what? For what?
So he ends up actually, filing a formal lawsuit. And so he sues them for defamation. He sues them for false arrest and imprisonment. He hadn't, again, actually been charged. So to give you the chronology, okay, and the murder takes place October 24, 2011. I get to go take sworn testimony under oath from Nick. I believe the first time was in April of 2012. And again, this is in a process that's somewhat unique to New York, where I'm taking testimony from him under oath before his lawsuit. And I'll be honest with you, Roberta, I met with state police people, et cetera. Obviously, there's a lot of people interested in the fact that I'm going to take sworn testimony from the guy that they're looking at as having possibly committed this crime. And that never happens. I've described this in the past as the OJ case backwards, because, OJ gets charged, and there's other parallels here. Obviously, OJ's African-American, Nick is Jamaican-American, and Nick was Nick was in many ways the OJ of Potsdam, because he's a former, I think they were Division III national champions at St. Lawrence in either 1999 or 2000. Him and Tafari and a bunch, and Tafari, whose real name is Howard, I think, Beckford. He changed his name in college or law school. The police are keenly interested in, will this guy testify? My first reaction, and I had many times in the past where I'd represented police agencies and much less involved criminal aspects, and typically what would happen is the attorney representing the would-be plaintiff who's claiming, let's just say, malicious prosecution or false arrest, says, well, listen, my client's just going to plead the fifth at the what we call a 50H examination, refers to Section 50 of the New York General Municipal Law. Let's just put it off for a while until the other things get resolved. So, because, again, it never happens. You never get to question the person that's, the unnamed prime suspect under oath in the middle of the investigation before the guy's even been charged with anything. They're still developing their case with not only the village of Potsdam, but, this was heavily involved was the New York State Police Bureau of Criminal Investigation. They were obviously much more equipped to investigate and pursue these things. So I take testimony from him in April of 2012, about 3.5 hours worth of testimony. Lots of good stuff comes from that, things we didn't know, and we'll touch on that in a few minutes. And then after that, the formal lawsuit gets filed, and then about a year later, I get to take testimony from him. This time, it's videotaped in the conference room at my old office, and this is essentially a 7-hour interrogation, of Nick. And the Potsdam chief, then Chief Tischler, Lieutenant Murray are with me because they were named in the lawsuit, so they're right to be there. But I'm their representative, their legal representative. He knows this. His attorney knows this. And, quite frankly, but for the fact, and this is no question in my mind, I've been told this umpteen times by the various investigators and prosecutors involved, but for the fact of Nick Hillary testifying to me under oath on 2 different occasions, this thing never gets off the ground as far as any type of prosecution, let alone indictment or anything else. None of that would have ever happened. So Nick basically, with the assistance of his best friend from college, affirmatively placed himself in legal jeopardy. And, in anticipation of all of that, I made sure that we had a stipulation and a so-ordered court order from our federal magistrate judge, even though I didn't need it, to cover everything, to make sure that anything we developed in the context of the civil case could be used against him down the line, because I knew what was at stake here.
Just to let my audience know,
sure,
those depositions you did of Nick Hillary are some of the most amazing, sharp, observant depositions I've ever seen done by a lawyer. Because, for example, one of the things that the media really centered around was Mr. Hillary's possible limp the day after. First of all, why would a limp be telling as far as a suspect in this case? And what did Nick Hillary say about the shape of his ankle in that deposition?
Sure. So the reason that the police are of the belief that the perpetrator of this crime may have possibly suffered an injury is whoever did this in their mind at the time had to be fairly athletic, and also they exit through a rear window on the second floor of this, older Victorian style building, apartment house, if you will, in Potsdam. So these have like 12-foot ceilings on each floor. So the person who had to get out the second floor window, jump down to, there was sort of like a small outbuilding portion of the back, jump down to that, and then jump probably 12 feet, 15 feet down to the ground. And there was a skid mark in the grass. Keep in mind that night was a dreary, somewhat rainy on and off night. And there's a skid mark in the grass where you can clearly see someone landed there and their foot slid out from under them. And again, because of the weather, they were never able to get, shoe impressions or any of that other stuff. So they're believing that whoever did this, very likely may have suffered a lower leg injury. Well, lo and behold, the next night is October 25th. Nick is coaching on the sidelines as the head coach at Clarkson, which is in Potsdam. St. Lawrence University, by the way, is just down the road in Canton, where Nick had gone to undergrad. And he is videotaped by the New York State Police. And the video isn't the greatest quality in the sense that it's not on a tripod. So it is a bit jumpy at times. But at times, it appears that Mr. Hillary is either favoring his right leg or limping, okay? And there are other times, I'll be the first one to tell you, it looks like he's walking fine. And, having a former college athlete myself, having suffered all kinds of lower leg injuries, there are times when I had, injuries and I played through them. You wouldn't have known that my ankle was swollen or my knee was swollen, whatever. So with Nick, of course, his supporters have jumped on, well, look at this video. You can see he's walking fine. Even though Lieutenant Murray, as part of the warrant application, he says, hey, I saw him. I observed him to have a significant limp at times during his walking up and down the sidelines. So again, Nick's supporters have jumped all over this video. It shows he didn't have a limp. Well, that's great, except for the fact that Mr. Hillary admitted under oath to me twice, okay, that he had actually suffered an ankle injury to his right ankle. Now, he claimed that injury was sustained approximately a week before the homicide. And the other thing they discovered when they finally executed the search warrant on his person, that his ankle was, again, he gets photographed from head to toe. That ankle was slightly swollen. That ankle had a fresh, and when I say fresh, as in still, you could still see the blood in it, abrasion on the outside of the ankle bone. And, again, Mr. Hillary insisted, oh, no, that happened a week earlier when, and this is a quote, I was moving furnitures, plural, around my apartment. He couldn't explain how the incident occurred, what time of day it occurred. And then actually, when I deposed him the second time around, he tried to back that out a month, that it was a month prior to the homicide. And I pulled out his prior sworn testimony and said, wait a second. You told me back in 2012, not 4 or 5 months after this homicide, that it was a week before. Wasn't that true? Oh, yeah, you're right. So, because he was trying to distance himself and put time in between the ankle injury that he admits he sustained. So again, to all the Nick Hillary supporters out there, the guy admits under oath, my ankle was swollen, had an abrasion, laceration on it. Again, he claims it was a week before the murder and not the night of.
There's also another video of him of Nick Hillary stalking Garrett right before his murder. Can you talk about that and what Nick Hillary said about what he was doing in that parking lot?
Sure. Yeah, and that was, the biggest piece of information that the police had in many ways, in addition to eyewitnesses. So they interviewed a whole bunch of people who placed Nick in his vehicle around, if you will, Potsdam High School, around Market Street apartment where Garrett lived with his mom. Again, these things are about 2 long blocks apart, okay? And Nick had I'm blanking on what year it was. I think it was a 2009 light blue Honda CRV. It had a couple of stickers on the back window that made it distinguishable, even though, for example, the Potsdam High School and Canton Potsdam Hospital security camera footage, you cannot identify a license plate or a driver. Okay, does that CSI? Let's zoom in on the driver. Oops, that's Nick behind. Doesn't exist.
Doesn't happen in real life, no.
not yet, at least, or maybe with some of the better high def security cameras nowadays. But in any event, back in 2011, it didn't. So the police have this Potsdam High School security camera footage that shows a vehicle that appears to be Nick's vehicle pulling into the parking lot, and it does some unusual things in relation to the weather, number one, what's going on, and Garrett as well. So a couple things about that. Nick lives about a third of a mile north of Potsdam High School. Again, Potsdam's not a big place. I think the village itself is probably a mile square, maybe. And Potsdam High School is on Leroy Street. And Nick Hillary lived in an apartment complex on Leroy Street. That apartment complex only had one means of vehicular egress and ingress, and that was on Leroy Street. So in questioning Nick, both the first time and the second time, particularly the first time, I want to establish his version of his chronology of events. What did you do that day? Where did you go? Where did you come from? Where did you go to? All of those things, every step along the way. And Nick basically says, well, I did go to Potsdam High School to see, there was a soccer game going on between Potsdam High School and I don't recall the other school. And he claims he's going to go, scout the game, even though he's never recruited a single player from Potsdam High School ever. Doesn't even know who's playing in the game other than the team. So anyway, so he says, I went from my home to Potsdam High School, which means he would turn right on Leroy Street out of this apartment complex, drive a third of a mile down the street, turn left into Potsdam High School. Unfortunately, there's security camera footage that shows his vehicle coming north on Leroy Street and turning right into the parking lot. So there's lie number one, in the sense that he's coming from the exact opposite direction where he claims he was coming from. Okay, does that mean you killed somebody? No. However, it continues. And that car, that light blue CRV, comes in the parking lot, comes down, and comes to a stop at one point where it's not visible on the camera, but if you know the layout of both the high school and the middle school, Garrett's over at the middle school playing basketball in the gym with some friends. They get kicked out of the gym because it's closing time, if you will, and Garrett's got to go home and get changed for soccer practice. So Nick is in his vehicle. Again, he admits and I never even had to show him the video. I got him to put himself in his car doing all these things on his own. So Nick says, yep, I'm in my car. I pulled over to the side and now I'm facing the middle school. And it's about 190, 200 yards between the two schools. There's nothing in between. It's an open field with a concrete sidewalk, and Garrett's coming towards him on his ripstick. Did you see Garrett? No, I didn't see Garrett. Nope, didn't. You couldn't not see Garrett, especially he knows Garrett. He lived with the kid for 6 months. Then he tools around to a parking spot. Now, mind you, he's there to watch a soccer game. Where he first parks, you cannot see the field. It's obscured by a big yellow school bus and a concession stand. So the soccer game he allegedly is going to watch, he cannot see from where he's parked. So he slowly loops back around, and now he drives down and he pulls into a parking spot facing a fence and a stand of pine trees, from which you, again, cannot see the soccer field or soccer game you're allegedly there to watch. And he never leaves his vehicle. He doesn't shut the car off. He just sits there. And then you see Garrett come along on the sidewalk behind Nick's vehicle. Again, Nick's nose in the opposite direction. And Garrett comes along on the sidewalk on his ripstick. And Nick claims, I never saw him. I have no idea he was there. But here's where it really gets weird, is as Garrett goes by, Nick's brake lights come on seconds later. He backs out, and now he's following in the same direction as Garrett. Garrett goes out to the driveway entrance, stop sign. Garrett turns left on Leroy Street. Nick comes to that very same stop sign, and Nick turns left on Leroy Street in the same direction as Garrett. Mind you, he told me under oath 2 different times, I went home, I went straight home, I stopped nowhere, I spoke to no one, and the simplest and easiest way to go home is to make a right turn, obviously, and drive back up the street a third of a mile. So, Nick tried to, well, I don't remember if I turned left or right. Well, if you did turn, where were you going? I was going home. Well, you wouldn't do that, number one, because that's not the fastest, simplest way home. Even his daughter admitted the fastest way home was to turn right. But the second thing, and Roberta, I've said this many times, is, Nick gives a very specific chronology and version of where he went that afternoon. and how he got there. And we can prove where Nick Hillary was in many ways by where Nick Hillary wasn't. So whether he was going to go to the college, Clarkson, or if he was going to drive around the hospital and go all mile and a half out of his way to get home, we know he didn't do those things because he doesn't show up on security cameras he would have had to have shown up on had he gone any of these other ways to get back home, which totally undermines his claim that I went home. We know he couldn't have gotten home because he never passes any of the cameras he has to pass to get there. Okay. One thing he can do without passing cameras, though, is to go left, drive down another block, and avoid the hospital and curl around near Garrett's apartment and pull in, and he'll never be seen by a soul. So that was the significance of that parking lot security camera footage was, the police at the time, and again, in April of 2012, or even October of 2011, they don't know, they can't prove that's Nick until Nick comes and says, yeah, that's me.
Wow. Talk about not being helpful for your own defense, and talk about talking yourself into a murder trial. So you just mentioned it briefly, but what was Nick's, did he have an alibi?
Yeah, so Nick's alibi is that I went home from that parking lot and I get back home at, let's say 20 after 5, something along those lines. And I stayed at my apartment for a brief period of time, and then I went out somewhere else. So his alibi witness is his then teenage daughter, Shanakay, who says, oh yeah, Dad got back home. Nick says, in fact, that he was home a little bit before 5, and the daughter says, yeah, he was home from roughly 4:45, let's say, to 5:20 or so, and then goes off to campus for soccer practice that night. And Shanakay, we took testimony from her too, and it was this rough period of time in the evening. She turns into a Swiss watch, mind you, about, oh yeah, no, Dad was home from 5 to 5:15, which the fascinating part about that testimony was that it came out later after she was questioned at trial, that was the time of day that she was asked to focus on by Nick's best buddy there, Mannyy Tafari, to the exclusion of any other time of day. Well, how would you know to focus on 5 to 5:15? Again, she says that conversation happens, I believe, on October 27th. The public didn't know. It was not public at this point in time as to when exactly Garrett had been attacked. Because again, he wasn't declared dead, unfortunately. He passed, but he wasn't declared for several hours because they tried to resuscitate him at the hospital. So that was a very significant thing, is how could Nick's best buddy have known to focus on 5 p.m. to 5:15 p.m. as the window as to when this attack took place, to ensure that Nick has an alibi from his daughter. Now, I know we've talked about this in the past. One of the interesting things about that whole alibi is, she says, and we asked her some generic questions at her deposition. Well, what did you do after your dad left? Oh, well, I ate dinner. What'd you have for dinner? Oh, I had spaghetti or pasta. I can't remember anymore what she said exactly. But the interesting thing was, she texts her dad, I think it was at 6:24 p.m. because he's back at Clarkson for soccer practice. What's for dinner? Well, why are you texting somebody what's for dinner if you already ate your dinner? According to her, under oath, she'd already eaten. So, there were inconsistencies, to say the least. And then this curious issue of knowing what exact time frame to focus on of that early evening to provide Dad an alibi, and that information, coming presumably by way of Mannyy Tafari.
Interesting. But I can hear Nick Hillary's supporters screaming, you didn't talk about the window and the fingerprint on the window. What is the significance of the fingerprint on the window?
So yeah, the back window that the perpetrator goes out, all right? So keep in mind, Officer Wentworth is at the front door of the apartment knocking on the door while the end of this attack takes place, or at least the attack is over and the perpetrator's still in there. So the perpetrator has to escape out a back window. So the police, they did all kinds of fingerprint stuff all over that apartment. Keep in mind, Nick's fingerprints would have been all over that apartment because he was in there several times in the weeks leading up to the homicide and helped move them in. But this particular fingerprint, it was an unidentified fingerprint found on the windowsill of that back window that the perpetrator went out. And unidentified meaning they took fingerprints of everybody. I mean, you know, Tandy's family, friends, Nick, you name it, former boyfriends, other people, the kids that were friends with Garrett. And this fingerprint didn't match anybody at any point in the investigation. So, and again, Nick's supporters were like, well, that's proof positive that it wasn't Nick. It's like, no, that's just proof positive of an unidentified fingerprint of somebody that who knows how long that fingerprint had been there, number one. Wasn't necessarily from the perpetrator, you know, because this is an apartment that there had been maintenance work done there. I mean, I think they even went and got fingerprints from either the carpet guy or the painter that had painted it not long before Tandy moved in. Didn't match that individual either. But again, that's, you know, something that Nick's supporters have pointed to, despite the plethora of circumstantial evidence of Nick being, you know, at or about this apartment, following Garrett and various other things that they choose to willfully ignore, but focus on, you know, again, this fingerprint that no one has any clue who that belonged to. And it, you know, incidentally, one of the things that was believed, the fingerprint was somewhat small. I believe it was a thumb, and they believed it was likely possibly a child fingerprint, but it didn't match Garrett, it didn't match Erin. So no one really knows who it was.
Interesting. So with all this weak alibi, puts himself in the car following Garrett right before his murder, how did Nick Hillary get acquitted of this crime?
So, you know, very good question, Roberta. So the initial trial was actually supposed to happen in November of 2015. It got adjourned to February 2016, then August of 16. It finally goes forward in September of 2016. And it's an interesting story in terms of the trial, in that it's going to be a jury trial. The defendant in a criminal case in New York, probably most other states, but in New York at least, they have the option of having a jury trial or having a bench trial. Jury trial, you're going to have 12 jurors that have to be unanimous in their decision. And a bench trial, the judge is both the finder of fact and the ruler on law, and you have to convince one person. So, you know, we'll talk a little bit more about the DNA, but there was DNA evidence found under one of Garrett's fingernails that was linked to Nick Hillary, and that was a big deal. And I believe Judge Katina, on the morning of, I believe it was day 2 of jury selection, I think they'd gotten 8 or 9 jurors on day 1 of jury selection. And they originally thought it was going to take them weeks to get a jury. They got a lot of jurors. Day 2, Katina affirms a prior ruling he made to keep the DNA evidence out. Again, this is the stuff that puts Nick in the room. You know, there's a lot of circumstantial evidence. You can put him around the building and all the other reasons why, and various other things we haven't even touched on, and, you know, the Jeff James phone call and various other things. This puts him in the room. Anyway, Felix Katina rules, no, I'm not going to allow that in. The defense, I think, very adroitly says, well, geez, we got a favorable ruling from this judge. Let's go with a bench trial, which they do. So off goes the jury pool.
What's a bench trial, just for my audience?
Yep, sorry. So a bench trial is where everything gets decided by the judge who's hearing the case. The judge is both the finder of fact, the jury, if you will, and the ruler on all things law related. So the judge is going to do everything. You're going to argue your case to the judge, and the judge is ultimately going to deliberate and determine whether or not this individual is guilty or not guilty of the charged crime. And that's what happened in this case. Felix Katina was the trial judge. I know I touched on DNA. I don't know if you want to go down that road yet or something else.
Yeah, I think this is a good time. So why do you feel in previous episodes you said that, I don't know, I'm using my language, not yours.
Sure.
That the judge was sort of bamboozled by the defense attorneys regarding the DNA. Why do you feel the DNA should not have been thrown out?
Sure.
And why do you think it points to Nick Hillary?
So there's a couple of components to that. Let's talk about the initial DNA, if you will, traditional DNA. So the initial DNA testing comes back from underneath one of Garrett's fingernails. I believe it was July of 2012. And in the state police crime lab, that just traditional DNA testing, you're gonna have 15 alleles, or let's call them markers, okay? And in the initial DNA testing, it's a mixed sample of genetic material that's under Garrett's fingernail. Mixed meaning it's largely like 95 or 96% Garrett's genetic material, which again, if I scrape your fingernails, you're gonna have your genetic material there. And there's 4 or 5% of this very tiny sample that's an unknown male donor. Unknown because of the 15 alleles in the initial testing and under the technology they had at the time, they could only extrapolate or identify 7 out of the 15 alleles. Okay, all 7 of those matched Nick Hillary and no one else, mind you. But that's not sufficient under the lab reporting guidelines to say it's this guy, all right? Fast forward, I believe it was July or August of 2014, there's newer DNA technology in use at the State Police Crime Lab, and now they're able to extrapolate, I believe, 9 out of the 15 alleles. Unfortunately, it's also a destructive testing process, and this was the last bullet they got in the DNA gun. But now they're able to pull 9 of 15 alleles, and all 9 match Nick Hillary and nobody else. So again, it's not enough, Roberta, at that point to say this is the guy. And I don't know if they needed 15 out of 15 or 14 out of 15. I don't recall, but it's not enough. So the state police and the prosecution, they decide we're going to pursue some other avenues in relation to this DNA sample. They tried at a company, I believe, Dr. Perlin out of Pittsburgh, True Allele didn't come up with anything. And then there was another emerging technology company out of, I believe, New Zealand called StarMix, or STR Mix. They call it StarMix. And what StarMix does is StarMix doesn't test the DNA per se, like the State Police Crime Lab did. But what they do is they take these mixed DNA samples and they compare that against existing DNA databases to come up with a probability, okay, of what are the chances it's anybody other than this person's DNA. And they came up with a statistical analysis of about 30 million to 1 that it's anybody other than Nick Hillary, okay? And the defense in this case, Nick's criminal defense team, they decided to attack the StarMix science, if you will, to throw it out. And also they tried to attack the underlying data on which the StarMix analysis was based on. And the interesting thing that happened was Felix Katina comes out with a ruling that says, hey, StarMix is good science, absolutely good science. It had been held admissible in a few other courts in New York as of that point in time. But then again, that defense argued that the underlying data that StarMix compares this to hadn't been properly validated. Just so happens in my career doing federal drug testing defense work for federal drug testing labs, I knew a whole lot about lab validation studies. And in my view, the data had been validated previously by a different lab. Then it comes to the state police, who then gets it to StarMix, if I recall correctly. And you don't have to revalidate this data. And that's where I believe that the defense, quite adroitly hoodwinked Felix Katina into buying this argument that, well, while the science is good and the analysis is good, the underlying data you can't legally rely on, therefore you have to throw the whole thing out. So that was a huge win for Nick's defense team. Huge, because again, that DNA puts Nick Hillary in the room under Garrett's fingernail. And we know that Garrett was asphyxiated. We know that. And in fact, Garrett was face down on the ground while he was being asphyxiated from behind, because he had rug burns on the upper part of his knees, so just above the kneecap, on the lower thigh, if you will, which imagine if you're face down on the ground and you're pushing with all your might the strongest thing you have to push against is going to be that part of your body. And he had almost rug burns there as he was fighting for survival in that room.
Awful, awful.
Yeah.
So Nick Hillary also had a patron to fund his defense, Sarah Johnson, who went to school with him. She produced the film Birdman, and her father is Charles B. Johnson, the builder of Franklin Templeton Investments, and he's also co-owner of the San Francisco Giants. She produced this film that you were in called Who Killed Garrett Phillips. Were you surprised when it came out that it was such an advocacy piece for Nick Hillary?
Actually, I wasn't at all. I knew going in. And the reason I agreed to be interviewed as part of that production was I was damn certain going to tell Garrett's story as often as I could possibly tell it to as many people as I could. And if there was any part of me that was going to be in there, I wanted it to, or any part of what my involvement in the case was going to be, I wanted it to come from me. Again, I'm sure I gave a lengthy interview. I'm sure most of it wasn't used because we knew going in who was funding Nick's criminal defense. We knew going in who was funding this documentary. I knew that it was going to be a pro-Nick production, shall we say. And it was, and it was, largely ignored lots of information and, of course, spun a lot of things in Nick's favor. And one thing, I know I mentioned this briefly before, just for your audience, the ones especially who aren't familiar. I mentioned earlier how Nick actually had been notified. Okay, again, in my view, Nick's the guy who actually kills Garrett, so obviously he knows Garrett's dead. But the police don't know this at the time they first go to talk to him. Nick got a phone call at 8 o'clock approximately that night from a guy named Jeff James. And Jeff has since passed away, but he filled out a supporting affidavit to the police where he says, yeah, I called Nick and said, hey, you might want to sit down. Something happened to Garrett. He's dead. This is hours before the police go to see him, where Nick feigns, oh my God, I can't believe this. What a shock, et cetera. They didn't know that he'd received this phone call at the time. And the amazing thing about Nick, the amazing thing to me about this guy, and I don't mean that in a positive light, by the way, is that when I questioned him on the oath, and every single time anybody talked to him where they believed it was the first time they were telling him this news, Nick himself admits, I get this phone call from Jeff James. Did you ask him what happened? No. Were you curious? No. Did you care about Garrett? Yup. But you didn't ask? You get a phone call? That's something. And Nick, mind you, to be fair to Nick, he admits all Jeff told me was something happened to Garrett. He didn't say he was dead. Jeff's affidavit says, nope, I told him something happened to Garrett. He's dead. I don't care if Jeff didn't tell him he was dead. I get a phone call from somebody I know that my ex-girlfriend's 12-year-old son, something happened to him. The first words out of my mouth, oh my God, what happened? Not once did Nick, in any interview with anybody, ever ask what happened to Garrett. Not once. He had, I think, Bill Fitzpatrick in his closing argument at the criminal trial, it was like, a stunning lack of curiosity on Nick's part, an unexplained lack of curiosity, if you will.
Also, a stunning lack of memory when you deposed him. I think he said, I don't recall, maybe 500. I mean, my memory is 500 times, and obviously my memory is exaggerated, but I've just never seen a witness answer, I don't recall, so many times.
Yeah, it was unreal. I mean, things that you would expect someone to remember. Now, mind you, I had already taken 3.5 hours of sworn testimony from the guy, so I had a timeline. I had a whole chronology that he'd already given me, and then fast forward to the 7-hour, video deposition, and I do not recall. I do not recall, with his attorney objecting up and down all the time, and I firmly believe that was a cue for Nick, to say I don't recall. But and the funny thing is, Roberta, I know we've talked about this in the past. It was like, things you should remember. I mean, I even asked him, like, who broke up with who, you or Tandy? I do not recall.
Yeah.
Really?
I know that stuck out to me. I remember every single one of my breakups, who broke up with who.
Of
And I think
course.
every single person in my audience would too. So I can hear the Nick Hillary supporters screaming, "John Jones! Who is John Jones? And why don't you find him a good suspect for Garrett's murder?"
Sure. So John Jones, I believe he's still with the St. Lawrence County Sheriff's Department. He was a sheriff's deputy at the time. He had previously dated Tandy, Garrett's mom, well over, I think, a year prior to the murder. And when Tandy takes up with Nick, and mind you, I think both in the HBO documentary and Dateline and/or 2020, it's definitely the HBO documentary tries to portray Nick as this, wonderful guy, great father. Nick was stepping out on the baby mama of his kids routinely back then, and that's how he meets Tandy, his ex. I think if they were common law husband and wife, she actually threw. I'm blanking on her name. She threw him out of the house and his stuff. But anyway,
Wait, you just went out for a little
sorry.
bit. Your audio just went out. Can you just say that again, please?
Sure. So if the part that you missed was about Nick,
Stepping out.
yeah. So
That's the end of it.
he's always on the prowl back then, and he's living with the mother of his children. They're essentially common law husband and wife, if you will. When he meets Tandy, and his again mother of his children, who he got back with after the murder, she'd thrown him and all his stuff out of the house. He'd actually filed I believe, a criminal complaint against her for destroying his soccer trophies or something like that. Anyway,
How many criminal complaints does this guy have?
yeah. So John Jones was the original question, right? So John Jones,
Yeah.
Nick and John had a verbal altercation at some point when Nick starts dating Tandy. But fast forward a year, and again, Nick's supporters are like, "It's John Jones. John Jones. John Jones should have done it." And Nick's defense was routinely pointing the finger at this guy. John Jones lives literally on the block, Cottage Street, between Potsdam High School and the Marketplace building where Garrett and Tandy lived. Garrett goes by on the radiology suite security camera down Cottage Street in his ripstick and out of view. And next thing you know, John Jones, you see him on the emergency department camera. He pulls into his parking spot at his little house there, gets out of his car, goes in his house, comes out moments later, and he's walking his Labrador Retriever. It's drizzling. He's got an umbrella. The guy is seen on 2 or 3 different Canton Potsdam Hospital cameras, as well as there was a doctor's office around the corner. He's walking his dog. Again, probably a total of 5 different video cameras pick him up walking his dog at the time of the murder. So we know it wasn't John Jones. It could not have been John Jones. And more importantly, John Jones didn't match any one of the DNA alleles that they got from that DNA sample. So he was conclusively eliminated both on video evidence as well as DNA evidence that it couldn't possibly have been John Jones. And for all the people out there who keep saying, "Oh, it's John Jones," it wasn't John Jones.
So, how did Nick Hillary's lawsuit fare in the courts? I know it's a long saga, but
Yeah,
can you
very.
just give a few highlights of how it
Well,
fared and where it went?
highlights to me, lowlights for Nick, I guess. But so Nick had an original lawsuit that he filed. Again, after this notice of claim thing that led to my first testimony that I took from him, he files a lawsuit in St. Lawrence County Supreme Court. I removed it to the United States District Court for the Northern District of New York because it involved federal constitutional claims of violation of his rights. We litigated that case, took all kinds of depositions, and then in, I believe, 2014, discovery, which is the legwork of a civil case, was done, and I filed a motion. It's called a motion for summary judgment, but basically it's a motion seeking to dismiss the case. About 80 to 90% of Nick's claims in that lawsuit, which was his first lawsuit, were dismissed by the court in my motion. What was left of that case was really only about whether or not he was illegally detained or unconstitutionally detained on October 26, 2011, when he was questioned at the Potsdam police station. That lawsuit what was remaining in that lawsuit, I should say, went to trial in June of 2022 in front of Judge Sharp in the federal courthouse here in Albany. I had since left my old firm. I did civil defense work for 26 years. Then I moved over to the plaintiff's side 6 years ago. And actually, a guy that I went to law school with, I was his orientation advisor, Greg Johnson. He took over the file because I was now on the plaintiff's side of the world. And Greg did a phenomenal job, tried that case about a year ago. Just about 2 weeks ago, the trial ended, and the jury, picked by Nick's attorneys of his peers, found in favor unanimously for the Potsdam Police Department and Lieutenant Murray, and they dismissed that case. Nick's attorneys filed an appeal after that trial, and they ultimately abandoned that appeal. Now, there was another lawsuit that Nick filed, however. Nick filed a lawsuit after he was acquitted by Judge Castaneda. He had a different set of lawyers that filed a lawsuit against basically everybody and their brother involved in the prosecution and investigation of Nick. So the Potsdam Police, Lieutenant Murray, then District Attorney Mary Rain, Bill Fitzpatrick, the DA out in Syracuse, who was brought in as a special DA to prosecute the case. State Police, John Jones, I think, was a defendant in that, and the St. Lawrence County Sheriff's Department. Most of the defendants were dismissed from that case early on in the case, and eventually what remained of that was ultimately dismissed by Judge Sharp, and all that remained were claims against, I believe, the Village of Potsdam and Lieutenant Murray. And those claims were dismissed by Judge Sharp, over a year ago, I believe, if not longer. And then Nick Hillary appealed that dismissal. Okay, he abandoned the other appeal of his stuff remaining from his first case, the jury verdict against him. He abandoned that appeal, basically gave up. All right, he lost, he gave up. So this other appeal was heard by the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit approximately a month ago. It was early June, I believe, was oral argument before the panel of judges. And they just issued a decision in the last week, unanimously finding in favor of the Village of Potsdam and Mark Murray, and upholding Judge Sharp's dismissal of Nick's second lawsuit. So for all, and for Nick's supporters, I hope you understand this, but every single one of the claims that Nick made in both of his civil suits, every single claim was dismissed at some point or another, either by a judge or a jury, and upheld on appeal, or he realized he had no chance, so he abandoned appeal. Every single claim. That's amazing. And it shows you that they did everything right, the police, et cetera, that this was not the witch hunt that Nick's supporters and defense had claimed over the years, and that nothing was done unconstitutionally, in a discriminatory fashion, or anything else in relation to Nick Hillary and what went on in this thing. And so it's really the end of the road for Nick and his civil cases. Yes, he could file for a writ of certiorari with the United States Supreme Court, but he probably has, I think he has to get 4 of 9 judges to agree to hear the case, the appeal, okay? But he probably has a better chance of winning the lottery because they generally don't listen, or excuse me, they generally don't take garden variety, federal lawsuits. They usually take on things of great, import to the country as a whole, as we saw with the recent, student loan thing and, Second Amendment things or other constitutional things, not this. So this is truly, in my opinion, the end of the road for Nick. And, from a legal civil standpoint, shall we say. And here we are, Roberta, I can't remember you and I talked the first time several years ago. And
2020, yeah.
Yeah. And this, we're coming up on, this fall will be 12 years since Garrett passed. And, I know his mom has moved on in life. That doesn't change the hole that was left. And, I go and visit that kid's grave every time I'm in Potsdam because, a lot of interesting things happened to me as a result of my involvement in that case, and some good things in relation to my career. So in many ways, I feel like I owe that young boy a debt that I can never repay. So I am going to tell his story as often as I possibly can to as many people as I possibly can that, I know who killed Garrett Phillips, and a lot of other people do too. And, in my opinion, it will always and forever point in the direction of Nick.
He was just so loved. I mean, this has been the most gratifying case for me to report on, because I've heard from so many of the people that knew Garrett and loved him. And if I could be as 1/10 loved as that kid was, I'd be doing okay. It's just amazing how much support and how loved he was by the people of that town.
Absolutely.
Or village, town, village, whatever. But what did you think? Just one last question. So I
Sure.
just wanted to point out to my audience that every claim made in that documentary also, so it wasn't just Nick's claim, it was also the claim of HBO that the village of Potsdam was so racist towards him and unfair. Everything, all those claims were thrown. You can make those claims in a documentary, but they did not stand up in a court of law. I just wanted to point that out.
That's exactly it. And you know what? The best person you can take this to the bank on, the best person to believe as to whether it was fair or not for the police to be questioning Nick Hillary and focusing on Nick Hillary at that back again, these in the first days following Garrett's murder, is from Nick Hillary himself. I mean, his attorney at the conclusion of my lengthy, video deposition started asking him some questions, which generally speaking, you wouldn't want to do that. But I remember he asked Nick, did you believe it was fair for the police to be questioning you on October 26th of 2011? I guarantee you he was expecting Nick to say no, and he was going to expand upon why this was so racist or whatever. Nick said, yes, that was fair. So I picked up that baton and ran with it. I said, that was fair because you were a person who was involved in that kid's life. You're part of his de facto family, and you always look to the immediate family members. That makes sense. That's why you think it was fair, Nick, in your own damn words under oath. So, it frustrated the hell out of me that they played, as you want to call it, the race card all along. It had nothing to do with that. It had to do with good police work and Nick opening his mouth and causing problems for himself with these inconsistent statements that didn't match the facts on the ground and led to the police to start wondering, hey, wait a second, this guy's not telling us the truth any other than the day of the week. He's not telling us the truth at all. So he laid the groundwork for everything that happened to him, unfortunately for him. So if there's anyone he wants to sue, it should be himself.
I think that's a good place to end it. Tom Mortati, it's always such a pleasure to have you on. Thank you so much for this interview. I appreciate it.
You're welcome, Roberta. Great talking to you again.
All right. Thanks, guys. I'll catch you later.
Be well.